You've probably heard the name before. It echoes through history, whispered by generals and historians, the graveyard of empires. But why? How did Afghanistan, this nation right at the heart of Asia, earn such a terrifying nickname? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack. Think back to 2021. The world just watched as the United States, after 2 full decades of war, pulled its troops out. And almost overnight, the Taliban took over. But here's the thing. This wasn't some new, shocking story. It was just the latest chapter in a very, very old book. And it brings up a question that has stumped superpowers for literally centuries. Why does this keep happening? I mean, let's look at the British Empire. At the absolute peak of its power, we're talking the sun never sets era, they tried to bring Afghanistan to heel. Not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. And every single attempt ended in disaster and humiliation.
Okay, then came the Soviet Union, a Cold War superpower with this just fearsome military machine. They rolled into Afghanistan thinking it'd be a quick victory, in and out. Instead, they got trapped in a brutal, decade-long war that actually helped lead to the collapse of the entire Soviet Union.
And finally, the United States. With technology, funding, and military power that is just unmatched in human history, they spent 20 years there, the longest war in American history, and still couldn't secure a lasting victory. You see the pattern, right? It's undeniable. But what is driving it?
So, the answer, it turns out, isn't really about one specific battle or a single political blunder. It's actually a powerful mix of 3 factors that just keep showing up again and again. You could almost call them 3 curses that have doomed invaders for centuries.
It's like a recipe for resistance, and has 3 main ingredients. First, you've got the terrain. It's absolutely brutal, all jagged mountains and harsh deserts. Second, a culture of fierce tribalism that has never, ever liked being told what to do by a central government. And third, its location. It's a geopolitical crossroads, which means bigger powers are always getting involved. You put those 3 things together, and you have a perfect storm for any invading army.
And this is not a new thing, not at all. To really get a handle on Afghanistan, you have to look way, way back. This pattern of failed conquest is basically woven into its ancient history.
This cycle is just ancient. I mean, we see it with the Persians. Then Alexander the Great shows up and faces just unbelievable resistance from local tribes. A few centuries later, the Arab caliphates have a hell of a time trying to subdue the region's strongholds. Even Genghis Khan's legendary Mongol hordes met some of their toughest resistance right here. The Mughals, yeah, they managed to set up a government, but it was so shaky, constantly dealing with revolts. The lesson was always the same. Getting into the country's one thing, but actually holding it, that's a whole different story.
You don't even have to take my word for it. Over 2,000 years ago, Alexander the Great himself basically summed it all up. This quote just proves this has always been the core problem. It's a timeless warning from one of the greatest generals in history.
Okay, so let's fast forward to the 19th century. This is when that ancient pattern really collides with modern empires. Afghanistan is about to become the central chessboard in this massive geopolitical fight for control of Central Asia.
This whole rivalry was called the Great Game. You had Britain, which controlled India, absolutely terrified of Russia expanding south, and you had Russia just as worried about Britain creeping north. And smack dab in the middle was Afghanistan, the buffer state. Britain decided that to protect India, its jewel in the crown, it had to control Afghanistan.
And how did that work out? Well, they fought 3 separate wars, and all of them ended with pretty much the same outcome. The first war was a total catastrophe. It shattered the idea that the British Army was invincible. The second war, they won some battles but couldn't establish any lasting control. And the third war finally forced Britain to just give up and recognize Afghanistan's complete independence. The empire had been stopped dead in its tracks.
Decades later, another superpower would completely ignore the lessons of history. In 1979, right at the peak of the Cold War, the Soviet Union invaded to prop up a failing communist government, and in doing so, they walked right into the exact same trap.
But this time, the Great Game had new players. The whole thing turned into a classic Cold War proxy war. The United States, along with Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and others, saw a golden opportunity to bleed their biggest rival dry, so they started pouring in weapons and money to the Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen, turning a local war into a global battlefield.
The gap between what the Soviets expected and what they actually got was just massive. Their plan was for a quick, decisive operation, maybe 6 months, a year at most. What they ended up with was nearly a decade of brutal, grinding guerrilla warfare against fighters who knew every cave and every valley.
So why did this superpower fail? Well, it's our three curses again. The Mujahideen basically owned the countryside, using that insane terrain to their advantage. The war became a black hole for the Soviet economy. And in the end, many historians now believe this devastating war was a major reason the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The graveyard had claimed its biggest victim yet.
You would think, after all that, the world would have finally learned its lesson. But now, in 2001, history was set to repeat itself, this time with the world's only remaining superpower.
In the wake of the horrific 9/11 attacks, the mission, at least at the start, seemed very clear and, to many, totally justified. It was called Operation Enduring Freedom, and the goal was to dismantle al-Qaeda, which was hiding out in Afghanistan, and to kick the Taliban, who were protecting them, out of power.
The initial invasion was incredibly fast and successful, but that victory was, well, it was deceptive. The war just dragged on, becoming a generational conflict. 20 years? Just let that number sink in for a second. It became the longest single war America has ever fought.
And does this story arc sound familiar? A quick, early victory where the enemy government is toppled, but then a slow, stubborn resurgence. The Taliban just melted back into the tribal areas and launched a relentless guerrilla war. Despite trillions of dollars and so much effort, a stable, unified Afghan government just couldn't take hold. The ending was as tragic as it was predictable. The US pulled out, and the Taliban just walked right back into power.
In the end, the official reason for leaving sounded an awful lot like Alexander the Great's warning from millennia ago. President Biden's statement was a blunt admission that military power alone just wasn't going to solve the puzzle of Afghanistan. The curses of terrain, tribalism, and geopolitics had won. Again.
So if you take one thing away from all this history, it's this. Some places are simply resistant to outside control. Afghanistan is a land where loyalty to your tribe or your valley is way stronger than loyalty to a national government, where the geography itself is a weapon, and where foreign armies are always eventually seen as invaders. History shows this clear, repeating pattern of invasion, insurgency, and withdrawal. The British, the Soviets, the Americans, they all learned this lesson the hardest way imaginable. And it leaves us with one final sobering question. After all this evidence, after all these centuries, who would be bold enough, or maybe foolish enough, to risk entering the graveyard next?